I'm a forensic pathologist at the Clearwater County Coroner's Office in Millbrook, Oregon, or at least I was, until I submitted my resignation 4 weeks ago. You can call me Dr. Helena Vaughn if you want, though most people in the coroner's office just called me Doc Vav. During my 17 years there, I've seen everything you can imagine in forensic pathology: brutal homicides, mysterious suicides, devastating overdoses, tragic accidents, and every conceivable way the human body can meet its end. But what I'm about to tell you about is the one case that made me question everything I thought I knew about death itself, and ultimately led me to leave the profession entirely. Clearwater County Coroner's Office serves one of the most diverse jurisdictions in Oregon, covering over 4,800 square miles from the coastal communities to the Cascade mountain foothills. It's a comprehensive facility that handles some of the most complex death investigations in the Pacific Northwest. During my 17 years there, I performed over 2,800 autopsies, consulted on hundreds of suspicious deaths, testified in 89 court cases, and trained dozens of forensic pathology residents who have gone on to practices across the country. My path to forensic pathology wasn't typical. I originally planned to be a pediatric surgeon, but during my residency at Oregon Health and Science University, I was assigned a rotation in the medical examiner's office. Something about the precision, the detective work, the way a careful autopsy could give voice to the voiceless and provide closure to grieving families drew me in completely. I specialized in forensic pathology at the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology in Maryland, where I learned from some of the most respected names in the field. What I loved most about forensic pathology was its absolute reliance on scientific fact. In a world of uncertainty and emotional complexity, death investigation provided clear, measurable truths: body temperature, rigor mortis, livor mortis, decomposition patterns. These are the fundamental markers that tell us when and how someone died. The human body follows predictable, scientifically documented patterns after death that have been studied and verified for over 150 years. Algor mortis, the cooling of the body after death, is one of the most reliable post-mortem changes we use to estimate time of death. Under normal conditions, core body temperature drops approximately 1 to 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit per hour until it reaches ambient temperature. This rate can be affected by factors like body mass, clothing, environmental temperature, and cause of death, but the fundamental principle remains constant: dead bodies cool down. It's not a theory or a guideline. It's a biological certainty that has guided forensic science since the 1800s. Rigor mortis, the stiffening of muscles after death, typically begins 2-6 hours post-mortem and progresses predictably throughout the body. Livor mortis, the pooling of blood due to gravity, starts within 30 minutes to 2 hours after death. These changes, combined with temperature readings, decomposition patterns, and environmental factors, allow us to determine time of death with remarkable accuracy. In my 17 years of practice, I had never encountered a case that fundamentally challenged these scientific principles until I met Celestine Blackwood. Celestine Blackwood was a 29-year-old librarian who worked at the Millbrook Public Library in the heart of our small downtown district. Celestine was one of those people who seemed to know everyone in town. She had grown up in Millbrook, graduated from Millbrook High School as valedictorian, earned her master's in library science from the University of Oregon, and returned home to take care of her aging grandmother. She lived in a beautifully restored Victorian house on Maple Street that had been in her family for 3 generations. The house was known throughout Millbrook for its extensive gardens, which Celestine maintained with the same meticulous care she brought to organizing the library's collections. Neighbors often commented on how the flowers in Celestine's garden seemed to bloom longer and more vibrantly than anywhere else in the neighborhood. Celestine was known for her gentle nature, her encyclopedic knowledge of local history, and her uncanny ability to recommend exactly the right book for every library patron. Children especially were drawn to her. She conducted story time every Saturday morning, and parents often said their kids would ask specifically for Miss Celestine when they visited the library. But Celestine had been battling a serious health condition for the past 2 years. She had been diagnosed with dilated cardiomyopathy, a condition where the heart becomes enlarged and weakened, making it difficult to pump blood effectively. Unlike some forms of heart disease, dilated cardiomyopathy often progresses gradually, but it can occasionally cause sudden cardiac arrest, particularly in younger patients. Her cardiologist, Dr. Amanda Rivers, had been monitoring Celestine's condition closely. She was on a regimen of medications to help her heart function more efficiently, and had been counseled about the importance of avoiding excessive physical exertion and managing stress. Despite her condition, Celestine maintained an optimistic outlook and continued working at the library, though she had reduced her hours and given up some of her more physically demanding volunteer activities. November 22nd started as a typical Monday in Millbrook. Celestine arrived at the library at her usual time of 8:30 a.m. Despite the fact that the library didn't open to the public until 10 a.m., she liked to use those early morning hours to prepare for the day, organize returned books, and work on special projects. Her colleague and close friend, Margaret Steinberg, arrived at 9:15 a.m. to find Celestine already deep into cataloging a new collection of local history books that had been donated the previous week. Margaret later told investigators that Celestine seemed in good spirits and was excited about the upcoming Thanksgiving holiday. She was talking about her grandmother's apple pie recipe. Margaret recalled she had been planning to spend the entire weekend baking and preparing for their family gathering. She seemed tired, maybe a little more than usual, but she was definitely looking forward to the holiday. The library opened at 10 a.m., and Celestine worked her normal schedule, helping patrons, organizing the children's section, and preparing for the Saturday story time. Several regular library visitors later reported that she seemed her usual helpful self, though a few mentioned she appeared slightly pale and was moving more slowly than normal. At 2:30 p.m., Celestine told Margaret she was feeling unusually tired and asked if she could leave a bit early. This wasn't uncommon given her heart condition, and Margaret encouraged her to go home and rest. Celestine gathered her things, said goodbye to the afternoon staff, and walked the 6 blocks to her house on Maple Street. Mrs. Dorothy Chen, Celestine's next-door neighbor, saw her arrive home at approximately 2:50 p.m. Mrs. Chen was working in her front garden and waved to Celestine, who returned the greeting but seemed to be walking more slowly than usual. This was the last confirmed sighting of Celestine alive. At 6 p.m., Celestine's grandmother, Rose Blackwood, called to confirm dinner plans for the following evening. When Celestine didn't answer her phone, Rose wasn't immediately concerned. Celestine sometimes took afternoon naps when she was feeling fatigued from her heart condition. However, when Celestine failed to answer multiple calls throughout the evening and didn't respond to text messages, Rose became worried. At 9:30 p.m., she drove to Celestine's house and found it dark, with no response when she knocked on the door. Rose had a spare key and let herself in, calling Celestine's name throughout the house. Rose found Celestine in her bedroom, lying peacefully on her bed, fully clothed in the same outfit she had worn to work that day. She appeared to be sleeping, but Rose quickly realized something was wrong when she couldn't wake her granddaughter. Rose called 911 at 9:47 p.m. Millbrook Fire Department paramedics arrived at 9:54 p.m., followed closely by Officer Jake Morrison from the Millbrook Police Department. The paramedics immediately began checking for vital signs, while Officer Morrison secured the scene and began documenting the circumstances. Paramedic Supervisor Linda Walsh performed standard life-saving protocols, but it quickly became apparent that Celestine had been deceased for some time. There was no heartbeat, no respiratory effort, and no response to any stimulation. However, Linda noted something unusual in her report. Subject's skin temperature feels unusually warm for estimated time since death. Officer Morrison conducted a preliminary investigation of the scene. There were no signs of forced entry, no evidence of struggle, and no obvious trauma to Celestine's body. The house was secure, and nothing appeared to be missing or disturbed. All evidence pointed to natural death, likely related to her known cardiac condition. The Clearwater County Coroner's Office was notified at 10:15 p.m., and our on-call death investigator, James Rodriguez, was dispatched to the scene. James Rodriguez was one of our most experienced death investigators, with over 12 years of experience in post-mortem examination and scene analysis. He arrived at Celestine's house at 10:40 p.m. and began his standard protocol for sudden death investigation. James photographed the scene extensively, interviewed Rose Blackwood and the responding officers, and began his preliminary examination of the body. Everything appeared consistent with sudden natural death. Celestine was positioned naturally on her bed, showed no signs of trauma or distress, and the scene showed no evidence of foul play. But when James took Celestine's core body temperature at 11:15 p.m., he encountered the first sign that something about this case was different from any death investigation he had ever conducted. The digital thermometer read 97.8 degrees Fahrenheit. James stared at the reading, certain he had made an error. Based on the timeline they had established, Celestine had likely been deceased for approximately 6-8 hours. Even accounting for the warm indoor temperature of the house, which he measured at 74 degrees, her core body temperature should have dropped significantly below normal. By this time, he took the temperature again, using a different thermometer from his kit. The reading was 97.6 degrees Fahrenheit, essentially unchanged, and only 1.2 degrees below normal human body temperature. James had investigated over 800 deaths during his career, and he had never encountered a body that maintained such a high temperature hours after death. He took multiple readings over the next 30 minutes, each confirming the same impossible result. In his official report, James wrote, "Body temperature anomaly noted. Subject's core temperature remains elevated, despite estimated post-mortem interval of 6-8 hours. Recommend immediate consultation with Chief Medical Examiner regarding unusual post-mortem findings." I received James Rodriguez's call at 6:30 a.m. on Tuesday, November 23rd. I had been planning to spend the day catching up on paperwork and reviewing pending cases, but James's description of Celestine's temperature readings immediately grabbed my attention. "Dr. Vaughn," he said, "I need you to look at the Blackwood case from last night. I've been doing this for 12 years, and I've never seen anything like this. The body temperature doesn't make sense." I reviewed James's preliminary report and photographs while drinking my morning coffee. Everything about the case appeared straightforward. A young woman with known cardiac disease, found deceased in her home. No signs of trauma or foul play. Circumstances consistent with sudden cardiac death. But the temperature readings were indeed puzzling. "James," I said, "walk me through the timeline again. When was she last seen alive? And when was she discovered?" Last confirmed sighting was at 2:50 p.m. when her neighbor saw her arrive home from work. Her grandmother found her at 9:47 p.m. I took the first temperature reading at 11:15 p.m., which would put her post-mortem interval at approximately 8 hours, assuming she died shortly after arriving home, and the temperature was 97.8 degrees. Yes, and I took multiple readings with different equipment to confirm. "Dr. Vaughn, that body should have been significantly cooler after 8 hours. Even in a warm house, even with her body mass and clothing, the temperature should have dropped to the mid-80s at least. I had seen unusual temperature patterns before, Notes: bodies discovered near heat sources, cases involving certain medications or metabolic conditions that could affect cooling rates, and situations where environmental factors created unexpected preservation. But what James was describing fell well outside any normal variation I had encountered. "I'll meet you at the morgue at 8 a.m. I told him. "Let's take another temperature reading and get this body scheduled for autopsy today." I arrived at the Clearwater County Coroner's office at 7:45 a.m., 15 minutes before James was due to arrive. I wanted to review Celestine's file once more before examining the body personally. Celestine Blackwood had been transported to our facility at 1:30 a.m. and placed in our standard refrigerated storage, which maintains a consistent temperature of 38.40 degrees Fahrenheit. Bodies stored in our refrigeration units typically reach ambient storage temperature within 2-3 hours. At 8 a.m., James and I removed Celestine's body from storage. She had been refrigerated for over 6 hours, which should have been more than sufficient time for her body to cool to storage temperature. I inserted our most precise digital thermometer and waited for the reading. James stood beside me, both of us watching the display as it calculated the core body temperature. The thermometer beeped, and we both stared at the display in disbelief. 96.4 degrees Fahrenheit. "That's impossible," James whispered. I removed the thermometer and inserted it again, thinking there might be an equipment malfunction. The second reading was 96.2 degrees, essentially unchanged. "James," I said slowly, "this body has been in refrigerated storage for over 6 hours. It should be approximately 40 degrees. How is it maintaining a temperature of 96 degrees? I called in our chief medical examiner, Dr. Robert Sterling, to witness the temperature readings. Dr. Sterling had been practicing forensic pathology for over 25 years and was one of the most respected experts in the field. "Bob," I said when he arrived, "I need you to verify these temperature readings. Either our equipment is completely malfunctioning, or we're dealing with something that defies the basic principles of forensic science." Dr. Sterling took his own measurements using 3 different thermometers from different manufacturers. Each reading confirmed the same impossible result. Celestine Blackwood's body was maintaining a core temperature nearly 60 degrees above the storage environment she had been in for hours. "Helena," Dr. Sterling said, his expression troubled. "In 25 years of forensic pathology, I have never seen anything like this. This violates every principle of algor mortis that we know. There has to be an explanation. Some medical condition, some environmental factor, something we're missing." Before proceeding with the autopsy, I spent the morning making phone calls to colleagues across the country. I contacted the chief medical examiners in Seattle, San Francisco, and Denver, describing Celestine's case and asking if they had ever encountered similar temperature anomalies. Dr. Patricia Williams at the King County Medical Examiner's office in Seattle was the first to respond. "Helena, what you're describing is medically impossible. Dead bodies don't maintain core temperature without external heat sources. Are you certain there wasn't some kind of heating device near the body or malfunction in your storage equipment?" I assured her that our equipment had been thoroughly checked and that the body had been discovered in normal environmental conditions. Dr. Michael Rodriguez at the San Francisco Medical Examiner's office was equally puzzled. "I've been doing this for 20 years and I've never seen anything remotely like what you're describing. The only cases where I've seen delayed cooling involved bodies discovered in extremely hot environments, cars left in direct sunlight, bodies near industrial heat sources, things like that. But even then, we're talking about slowed cooling, not maintained normal temperature." The consensus from every expert I consulted was the same. What I was observing was scientifically impossible, according to all known principles of forensic pathology. While I was grappling with the medical impossibility of Celestine's condition, her family was dealing with their own confusion and grief. I met with Rose Blackwood and Celestine's parents, David and Sarah Blackwood, who had driven up from Sacramento as soon as they received the news. Rose Blackwood was an 82-year-old woman who had raised Celestine after her parents divorced when she was young. She was a retired school teacher who had lived in Millbrook her entire life and was deeply connected to the community. Dr. Vaughn, Rose said during our interview, "I need to tell you something about Celestine that might sound strange. She always had what you might call a special warmth about her. Even as a child, she never seemed to get cold like other kids. In winter, she would go outside without a coat and be perfectly comfortable. People used to joke that she had some kind of internal heater." Sarah Blackwood, Celestine's mother, nodded in agreement. She was always like that. When she was sick as a child, her fevers would break in ways that puzzled the doctors. She seemed to regulate her body temperature differently than other people. David Blackwood shared something that stayed with me for weeks afterward. "Dr. Celestine always said that when she died, she wanted to find a way to let us know she was okay. She was very spiritual, very connected to things beyond what most people can see. When we heard that her body was still warm when they found her, we wondered if that was her way of keeping her promise." I listened to the family's accounts with professional skepticism, but I couldn't dismiss the fact that they were describing temperature-related anomalies that had apparently been present throughout Celestine's life. As the day progressed, I continued monitoring Celestine's body temperature every few hours. By 2 p.m., nearly 16 hours after her discovery, and over 10 hours after being placed in refrigerated storage, her core temperature had dropped only to 94.8 degrees Fahrenheit. This was unprecedented in my experience. I had never seen a body maintain such elevated temperature for such an extended period, particularly under refrigerated conditions. I scheduled the autopsy for the following morning, November 24th, and arranged for Dr. Sterling to assist. I also contacted Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a cardiologist who specialized in sudden cardiac death, asking her to review Celestine's medical records and be present during the autopsy to help interpret any cardiac findings. That evening, I found myself lying awake, running through every possible explanation for what I was observing. Could there be some unknown medical condition that affected post-mortem temperature regulation? Was there some environmental factor I was missing? Had Celestine ingested some substance that could affect her body's cooling process? I reviewed medical literature on post-mortem body temperature, researched rare metabolic conditions, and even consulted textbooks on thermodynamics. Nothing I found could explain what was happening with Celestine Blackwood's body. At 10 p.m. on November 23rd, I returned to the morgue to take one final temperature reading before the autopsy. It had been approximately 24 hours since Celestine's death, and her body had been in refrigerated storage for nearly 21 hours. The thermometer read 93.1 degrees Fahrenheit. After 24 hours, Celestine Blackwood's body was still maintaining a core temperature only 5.7 degrees below normal human body temperature. According to every principle of forensic science I had learned and practiced for 17 years, this was impossible. I stood alone in the morgue, staring at the temperature reading, knowing that tomorrow's autopsy would either provide answers or deepen the mystery even further. What I didn't know was that Celestine's case would challenge everything I believed about the nature of life and death, and ultimately lead me to question whether the boundary between the living and the dead was as clear as I had always assumed. I arrived at the morgue at 6 a.m., 2 hours before the scheduled autopsy. I needed time to process what I was about to encounter and take one final temperature reading. At exactly 30 hours post-mortem, Celestine Blackwood's core temperature read 91.8 degrees Fahrenheit, still impossibly warm. Dr. Sterling and Dr. Walsh arrived at 7:30 a.m. I had briefed them extensively about the temperature anomaly, but seeing their expressions when I showed them the latest reading confirmed that even experienced medical professionals were struggling to comprehend what we were witnessing. Helena, Dr. Walsh said, examining her cardiac records. Celestine's dilated cardiomyopathy was significant, but not unusual. I've seen hundreds of similar cases. Nothing in her medical history suggests any condition that could affect post-mortem temperature regulation. At 8 a.m., we began the autopsy. I performed every procedure with meticulous care, knowing this case would likely be scrutinized by experts for years to come. What we discovered was both exactly what we expected and completely baffling. Celestine's heart showed clear evidence of dilated cardiomyopathy with acute cardiac arrest. The muscle walls were enlarged and weakened, consistent with her diagnosed condition. There were no signs of trauma, no evidence of drug use, and no indication of foul play. Toxicology screens would later confirm the absence of any substances that might affect body temperature, but throughout the 4-hour autopsy, her body maintained its impossible warmth. Even with the chest cavity opened and organs exposed to room temperature air, her internal temperature remained elevated. I had never seen anything like it. 3 days after the autopsy, I received a call that would deepen the mystery exponentially. Robert Hayes, the local mortician who had prepared Celestine's body for burial, contacted me with a trembling voice. "Dr. Vaughn, I need to ask you something about Celestine Blackwood. When her body arrived at my facility 4 days after the autopsy, there was something unusual." "What do you mean, Robert?" "The body was still warm, doctor, not just slightly warm, noticeably warm, to the touch. In 28 years of mortuary work, I have never encountered anything like this. Bodies are typically cold when they arrive from the coroner's office, especially after autopsy and refrigerated storage." I felt my hands begin to shake. "Robert, are you absolutely certain her body had been in our refrigerated storage for nearly a week?" "I'm positive, Dr. Vaughn. I even had my assistant confirm it." We both agreed the body felt unusually warm. It made the embalming process different. The tissues responded in ways I've never seen before. After hanging up, I sat in my office, staring at Celestine's file, trying to process what Robert had told me. If accurate, it meant Celestine's body had maintained elevated temperature for over a week after death, something that violated every known principle of forensic science and human biology. I spent the following weeks obsessively researching every possible explanation. I consulted with thermodynamics experts, reviewed obscure medical literature on post-mortem changes, and even contacted researchers studying near-death experiences and consciousness after clinical death. Dr. Patricia Huang, a physicist at Oregon State University, reviewed my documentation and was equally baffled. "Dr. Vaughn, what you're describing defies the laws of thermodynamics. A deceased human body cannot maintain core temperature without some form of energy input. There has to be a heat source we're not identifying." But we had ruled out every conceivable heat source. The house temperature, storage conditions, and environmental factors had all been thoroughly documented and accounted for. I began investigating whether Celestine had been taking any experimental medications or supplements that might affect body temperature regulation. Her pharmacy records showed only standard cardiac medications. Her physician confirmed she had been following conventional treatment protocols with no experimental therapies. 2 weeks after the autopsy, I met again with Rose Blackwood. She had been thinking about our previous conversation and wanted to share more about Celestine's unusual characteristics. "Dr. Vaughn, there's something else about Celestine that I didn't mention before. She had what people in our family called the gift. She could sense things about people when they were sick, when they were troubled, when they were going to pass away." Rose continued. 3 months before she died, Celestine told me she had been having dreams about crossing over to the other side, but being told it wasn't her time yet. She said in these dreams, someone was telling her she had work to finish here. "What kind of work?" I asked. "Helping people transition." Celestine always said she believed some souls need more time to let go, and that she was meant to help them. She worked with several elderly people in town during their final days, just sitting with them, holding their hands, Families said she had a way of bringing peace to dying people. Rose looked directly at me with clear, determined eyes. Doctor, I believe Celestine found a way to stay warm, so we would know she's still helping people cross over. Her body staying warm was her message to us that death isn't the end she thought it was, it's just a different kind of presence. A month after Celestine's case, I was called to examine another sudden death, an elderly man who had died of natural causes. As I took his temperature for the preliminary examination, I found myself obsessively checking and rechecking the readings, wondering if I might encounter another impossible case. I began questioning every aspect of my forensic examinations. When families asked about their loved one's final moments, I found myself wondering if consciousness might persist in ways our medical instruments couldn't detect. When I testified in court about time of death determinations, I felt uncertainty creeping into conclusions I had once stated with absolute confidence. The weight of these questions began affecting my ability to function as a forensic pathologist. How could I authoritatively determine time of death when I had witnessed something that defied all known scientific principles? How could I tell families that their loved ones had passed peacefully when I no longer understood the boundary between life and death? 6 weeks after Celestine's autopsy, I was examining a young mother who had died in a car accident. As I explained the findings to her devastated husband, he asked me a question that shattered my remaining confidence in my profession. Doctor, is there any chance she might still be aware somehow? Any chance she can hear us talking to her? Looking at this grieving man, knowing what I had witnessed with Celestine Blackwood, I realized I could no longer provide the definitive answers that families needed from forensic pathology. The certainty that had once defined my practice had been replaced by profound questions I couldn't answer. I submitted my resignation to the Clearwater County Coroner's office 3 days later. In my resignation letter, I wrote that I was pursuing alternative medical opportunities, but the truth was that Celestine's case had fundamentally altered my understanding of death and consciousness. I relocated to a small coastal town in Northern California and opened a general family practice. I deliberately chose work that dealt with healing and life rather than death and investigation. But I never stopped thinking about Celestine Blackwood and what her case revealed about the mysteries that still surround human consciousness and the dying process. I followed medical literature on consciousness research, near-death experiences, and advances in understanding the transition between life and death. I was encouraged by studies suggesting that consciousness might persist briefly after clinical death, and that our understanding of when life truly ends is more complex than traditionally believed. Celestine's case was eventually published in the Journal of Forensic Sciences as one of the most unusual temperature anomalies in medical literature. It continues to be cited by researchers studying consciousness, death processes, and unexplained post-mortem phenomena. But for me, Celestine's case represents something more profound than a medical anomaly. It serves as a humbling reminder that despite our scientific advances, fundamental mysteries about human consciousness and the nature of death remain unsolved. 5 years later, I still receive occasional calls from forensic pathologists who have encountered unusual post-mortem phenomena they can't explain. I always encourage them to document everything carefully and remain open to possibilities that current science cannot yet explain. Celestine Blackwood's body maintaining normal temperature for over a week after death was scientifically impossible. Every principle of forensic pathology, every law of physics and biology, every piece of medical knowledge I had accumulated over 17 years said it couldn't happen. But it did happen, and it changed everything I thought I knew about the boundary between life and death. Perhaps the most important lesson from Celestine's case is that death may not be the absolute endpoint we assume it to be. Her impossibly warm body might have been evidence that consciousness, awareness, or some essential aspect of human existence can persist in ways that our current medical understanding cannot detect or measure. For Rose Blackwood and Celestine's family, Her week-long warmth was confirmation that love and connection transcend physical death. For the medical community, it remains an unexplained phenomenon that challenges our fundamental assumptions about human biology. For me, it was a reminder that medicine, despite all its sophistication and scientific precision, still encounters mysteries that humble our understanding and force us to acknowledge how much we don't know about consciousness, death, and what it truly means to be alive. Celestine Blackwood's impossible warmth will always remain the case that taught me the most important lesson of my medical career. Sometimes the impossible happens, and when it does, it changes everything we thought we understood about the nature of human existence.